Welcome to Talks History with Donnie Dodson. I've always been drawn to Greek mythology. Not just because of the monsters and gods, but because of what the stories are really about. At their core, they're psychological maps of the human condition. They chart the inner terrain of ambition, temptation, courage, and pride. And when I was younger, I thought the myths were mostly fantasy. I loved playing God of War with my dad growing up with the old PlayStation 2 console and watching movies like Wrath of the Titans and Percy Jackson. Greek mythology was and still is so entertaining to me. But now, with the more history I read, the more I realize how deeply true they are. Because again and again, the same patterns repeat, rising fast and falling harder. In Greek mythology, you see it all the time. Take Icarus. Given wings made of wax and feathers, he's told by his father Daedalus to fly the middle path, not too high or too low. But in the thrill of the moment, the rush of power, he climbs towards the sun. The wax melts, and he crashes into the sea. That story isn't just about flying, it's about overreaching, about what happens when you start to believe you're above the laws of nature that bind everyone else. Or look at Bellerophon. He was a great hero, the slayer of Chimera. The gods gave him everything: strength, a divine steed in Pegasus, glory on the battlefield. But even that wasn't enough. He wanted to sit among the Olympians himself. So he tries to ride Pegasus up to Mount Olympus to claim a place he wasn't meant to have. Zeus sends a gadfly to sting the horse, and Bellerophon falls, crippled, disgraced, and forgotten. His punishment wasn't death. It was the loneliness of a man who had reached for power and lost everything in the process. These myths weren't random tales. They were warnings, stories told in temple courtyards and around family hearths, reminding listeners that the higher you climb, the more humility you need to keep from falling. And perhaps the most dangerous kind of fall is the one that's brought on by hubris, the blinding pride that convinces you the rules no longer apply. Even in Homer's Iliad, the great Achilles, strongest of the Greeks, nearly dooms his people because of his wounded pride. He withdraws from battle not just because he's tired, but because his honor was insulted. That desire for personal power over collective good costed thousands of lives. And only when grief strikes him when his friend Patroclus is killed does he return, humbled. The lesson is the same. Unchecked pride destroys even the greatest heroes of myth and legend. But not every myth ends in tragedy. Occasionally, a different figure appears. One who holds power briefly and gives it back. In Greek myth, that figure is rare. Power once seized is rarely released. That's why when the stories that do show restraint stand out all the more. Consider Prometheus. He defies Zeus to give fire to all of humanity. Not to become a god, but to help others, to help us. He suffers eternally for it, but his sacrifice is the opposite of ambition. It's the relinquishing of comfort for principle, not climbing Olympus, but lifting others towards it. And then there's Hercules, perhaps the most human of all the demigods, not because of his strength, but because of his service. After his labors, after his pain, he chooses to become a protector, not a king nor a tyrant, but a guardian. That's something deeply stoic about the idea of doing great things, enduring hardship, and then stepping back without the need of crown. When we move from myth to history, this pattern really doesn't vanish. It becomes even more real and rare. Because in the real world, very few people ever give up their power willingly. That's why the story of those who do almost feels mythic. They echo the values buried deep in the old tales, that true greatness isn't just what you conquer, but what you can walk away from. The stories from myth feel timeless because they echo in real lives. Men are not made of marble and myth alone, but of flesh and flaws. And as history marches on from the legends of Olympus to the annals of emperors, we see the same cycles. The rise, the ambition, and the great falls, played out again and again. Power seduces, and the stronger the man, the greater the temptation to believe that they are the exception, that fate bends for them, that the sun will not melt their wings, that they are truly gods. Alexander the Great is perhaps the clearest example of a mortal who became a legend in his own time. Tutored by Aristotle and crowned by conquest, Alexander believed he was not only the king of Macedon, but descended from gods. He wept at the edge of the known world because there was no more lands to conquer. But it was not the world that turned on him. It was his own mortality. After years of warfare, endless ambition, and the growing paranoia of a man who believed in his divine right, he died at just 32. His empire fragmented within months. His sons and generals fought each other, and the myth unraveled into dust. Julius Caesar saw this pattern too, but he thought he could outmaneuver it. A brilliant general, a populist reformer, and a man of supreme political instinct, Caesar crossed the Rubicon with his legions and remade the Roman Republic in his own image. The Senate named him dictator for life, and he wore purple like a king. And though he never took the title of Rex, the symbolism was clear. But the dagger of Brutus reminds us, even the most powerful man in Rome was vulnerable to the ancient fear of tyranny. Caesar died believing himself invincible, struck down not by a foreign enemy, but his own friend. Fast forward to the 18th century, and you find another colossus striding across Europe, Napoleon Bonaparte. He rose from obscurity on Corsica to become the master of France, a general of unmatched genius. He crowned himself emperor, quite literally placing the crown on his own head before the Pope could do it. His Code Napoleon reshaped legal systems, and his armies redrew the entire map of Europe. But ambition, once awakened, does not rest. He marched on Moscow. He alienated allies. He spread himself thin in pursuit of an empire that could never be totally held. And in the snows of Russia and the mud of Waterloo, it all fell apart. Twice exiled, he died a prisoner on the island of St. Helena. Not a crown on his head, but with bitterness in his heart and a stomach ulcer in his gut. And then we come to our most recent chapter, Adolf Hitler. He's no mythic hero, but just a man who studied the tools of myth, the speeches, the occult, the mass psychology, and twisted them into something monstrous, yet extremely powerful. He used myth and nationalism to hypnotize a wounded yet proud German people, drawing on Wagner and Norse legends to present himself as the Redeemer. But his power, like the others, was never truly enough. He wanted a 1,000-year Reich. He wanted Lebensbraun and purification. And in doing so, he brought about the most catastrophic war in human history and the deaths of millions. He too died in a bunker, broken, surrounded by ruins and betrayal. In every one of these men, the arc is the same. Meteoric rise, undeniable brilliance, and then the fatal overreach. Their stories are as intoxicating as they are cautionary. They did not lack talent, and they did not lack opportunity, but they refused limits, and so the world eventually imposed them. The clock always keeps ticking. The same wheels that lift you up will grind you down. No empire is eternal. No man can outrun the weight of history, not even those who believe they were born to rule it. Because history, like myth, obeys a logic deeper than just one life. Power acquired for glory always demands a price. There is no free lunch. And the bigger the shadow a man casts, the more people step forward to tear it down. Whether it's Roman senators, Russian winters, or allied coalitions, the end is always the same. The myth unravels, the crown slips, the sun burns the wings. But this episode is not about the men who clung to power until it destroyed them. It's about the very few who let it go. Because once in a great while, a different kind of figure emerges. A man who does not let power shape him, but instead shapes what power even means. A man who holds absolute authority in his hands, felt its gravity, tasted its sweetness, stood on the edge of permanence, and then walked away. These men are not remembered for what they conquered, but for what they chose not to keep. Their greatness is not in their rise, but in their retreat. There are perhaps no better examples of this than Lucius Quinctius Cincinnatus and George Washington. Both lived in times of great crisis. Both were summoned from private life to defend the very idea of a republic. Both were offered everything: unlimited power, the adoration of the people, and the opportunity to rule without total restraint. And both refused. Not because they lacked ambition, but because they saw that true service ends with a return to humility. Cincinnatus was a Roman farmer when the Senate called upon him. Rome was under siege, its consuls paralyzed, and only a dictator could save the state. They gave Cincinnatus full command, and in just 15 days he crushed the enemy, restored the state, and to everyone's astonishment, he handed back the authority. He returned not to a palace, but to his plow. He did not linger in the forum to bask in praise or plot his next command. He simply resumed the farming life he left behind. And Washington, too, was a farmer. A gentleman of Virginia with fame, fortune, and military glory. He led the Continental Army through a brutal, uncertain war with an unlikely prospect for victory. He endured Valley Forge. He managed mutinies, defeats, and hunger. And when the victory came, when the British surrendered and the new nation looked to him as its natural king, he shocked the world by resigning his commission. The King of England said if he truly gave up power, he would be the greatest man in the world. And he did. After serving 2 terms as president, with the entire country willing to make him a lifelong dictator, he stepped down. What binds these 2 men together across 25 centuries is not just their actions, but their restraint. They understood what power could do. But they also knew what it shouldn't. They were not myths, they were not gods. They were citizens first, and their power was a duty, not a prize. This is what makes their stories feel more miraculous than any divine myth, because they were real. And in a world where men often lose themselves in their ambitions, Cincinnatus and Washington became immortal not just through conquest, but through character. They offered a different model of leadership, one rooted in service, in limits, in letting go. And perhaps that is the ultimate test of a leader, not how fiercely he seizes control, but how gracefully he releases it. And in this episode, we will walk through the lives of these 2 great men. We'll explore the world they lived in, the pressures they faced, and the choices they made when offered everything. And in doing so, we'll ask a question that history rarely allows us to ask. What happens when the hero wins and walks away? Let's begin with the legendary Roman statesman and military leader of Cincinnatus, a figure wrapped in both myth, legend, and a bit of real history. To understand Cincinnatus, we must first understand the world he lived in. A Rome that barely resembled the imperial juggernaut we now picture when we hear the name. This was the 5th century BC, long before Caesar, long before Augustus, long before the legions thundered across Europe. Rome was not yet an empire. It was a fragile, scrappy republic constantly at war with neighboring tribes, wrestling with internal chaos, and struggling to define what it meant to be a Roman. This was also a time of deep political tension. The Roman Republic was in its infancy, having only recently overthrown its kings. The patricians, the old aristocratic families, held most of the power, while the plebeians, the common citizens, demanded more rights and representation. Out of this conflict came both turbulence and innovation. It was the stage of the 12 tables, the birth of consuls, and the rise of a senate as a political force. But it was also a time when records were sparse, and the line between history and myth was razor thin. Most of what we know about Cincinnatus comes from later Roman historians like Livy and Dionysius, and those sources must be approached carefully. They wanted to define what Roman virtue looked like, and in Cincinnatus they found their ideal, the noble citizen farmer who saved the republic and walked away from power. Whether every detail of his life is true or not matters less in the role he played in shaping Roman identity. His story is less a biography and more of a parable, a moral template for future generations. Cincinnatus was born into the patrician gens Quincia, an old and respected Roman lineage. In a time when family name meant everything, the Quinci were considered one of the foundational families of the early republic. They traced their heritage back to the very founding of the republic in 509 BC, when Rome cast off the rule of its kings. But while Cincinnatus' lineage carried prestige, the world he was born into was anything but stable. Rome in the early 5th century BC was small, hard-bitten, and constantly threatened, both from without and within. The city's defenses were simple earthen walls. Its economy was agrarian and vulnerable. Famine, tribal raids, and internal class struggles were a way of life. From a young age, Cincinnatus would have been trained in both civic virtues and martial disciplines that defined the Roman elite. He likely studied rhetoric, Roman law, and religious rituals, preparing for a life of public service. But unlike the opulence we might associate with later Roman elites, early patricians prided themselves on austerity. Wealth was not meant to be flaunted. Duty to the Republic came before personal luxury. The ideal Roman leader was expected to live plainly, speak honestly, and fight bravely. These ideals were deeply ingrained into Cincinnatus's education and character. Though the historical details are hazy, later writers suggested that Cincinnatus began his political life during one of the most turbulent periods of the young Republic. He would have witnessed the ongoing conflict of the orders, a bitter social struggle between the patricians and the plebeians. This was not a theoretical debate. It was a daily reality that defined Roman governance. The plebes wanted debt reform, protection from patrician abuse, and the right to hold office. The patricians resisted. Cincinnatus, raised in the charged atmosphere, seems to have internalized a deep sense of obligation, not to his class, but to the Republic and Rome itself. By the time he entered political office, possibly as a consul around 460 BC, Cincinnatus had already earned a reputation for discipline and unshakable principle. He was stern, frugal, and devoted to the old Roman ways. Stories portrayed him as a man with little tolerance for extravagance or corruption. And though he held significant influence, he did not seek to enrich himself through politics. In fact, it is said after his consulship ended and his family's reputation was tarnished by his son's alleged criminal conspiracy, Cincinnatus voluntarily retired from public life. He sold off much of his property to pay fines and debts and relocated to a small farm across the Tiber. There he lived in relative obscurity, plowing his own land, growing his own food, and keeping the flame of Roman virtue alive in his private life. This decision to retreat rather than retaliate, to serve the soil rather than seek revenge, is really what defined him. It wasn't weakness, it was restraint. And in time, the Republic would call him back again. In 458 BC, Rome was under siege. The Equi, a hostile tribe of the Appian Hills, had encircled a Roman army and trapped them in the Alban Hills. The situation was dire. The consuls were paralyzed by indecision and the Senate was in disarray, and the people feared annihilation. In desperation, the Senate invoked an ancient constitutional safeguard, the appointment of a dictator. A dictator in Rome was not a tyrant as we imagine today, but an emergency magistrate with absolute power for a strictly limited term, usually 6 months. It was the Republic's last resort, and when the Senate searched for a man capable of saving the state, they turned not to a rising general or cunning politician, but to the simple farmer. According to Livy, the delegation found Cincinnatus behind his plow, tilling his modest acreage with his own hands. When he saw the senators approaching in their ceremonial garb, he asked his wife Ricilia to fetch his toga so he could greet them with dignity. They informed him of the crisis and his appointment, and without protest he agreed to serve. He left the fields and followed the Senate back to the city, where he was vested with imperium, the absolute authority to act on Rome's behalf. What followed was swift and decisive. Cincinnatus raised a citizen army, marched out under the cover of night, and reached the besieged Roman forces by dawn. Using classic Roman tactics, he launched a surprise attack on the Equi from behind. While the trapped Romans surged forward, the encirclement became a rout. Within hours, the enemy was crushed and the siege lifted. Cincinnatus returned to Rome a hero, granted a triumph, and lauded by the Senate and people alike. But then came the moment that made him truly great. 16 days after accepting the dictatorship, with absolute power in his grasp, he resigned. He easily could have held on to his office. He could have rewritten laws, punished enemies, or accumulated massive wealth. Instead, he handed back his authority and returned to his plow. That single act became a moral touchstone of Roman republicanism. It was proof that power need not corrupt, that virtue could outweigh ambition, that a man could serve, succeed, and then surrender his place for the good of the whole. Cincinnatus was later called upon a second time in 439 BC, with internal threats again shaking the Republic. He took command, resolved the crisis, and once again stepped down voluntarily. These repeated acts of self-limitation elevated him beyond the realm of a mortal statesman. He became a symbol, the embodiment of Roman civic virtue, simplicity, and restraint. Later generations saw him as the model citizen soldier, a man who could wield absolute power without succumbing to it. Even if we take these stories with historical caution, as we must, given their preservation by writers like Livy and Dionysius long after the events occurred, the ideals represented are real. Rome needed historical myths to teach its citizens how to behave. And the myth of Cincinnatus taught Romans and later the world that the greatest leaders are not those who cling to power, but those who give it up. Cincinnatus really became more than a historical figure. He was elevated into a moral archetype, a blueprint of the citizen statesman who served not for glory, but for duty. His name was invoked in the writings of Renaissance humanists, Enlightenment philosophers, and the American revolutionaries as a symbol of what power ought to be: temporary, reluctant, and exercised with humility. In an age where kings claimed divine right and emperors cloaked themselves in grandeur, the memory of a farmer who refused a crown offered a radically different version of leadership. His example would resonate deeply with early American thinkers and founders. During the 18th century, when republics were once again being forged after centuries of monarchy, the tale of Cincinnatus became a powerful model for these new citizen leaders. Philosophers like Montesquieu and Rousseau saw in him a return to classical virtues of restraint, simplicity, and civic obligation. He was not driven by conquest or lust for power, but by a call of his community. And when that ended, so did his rule. This ideal took literal root in America. The Society of Cincinnati was formed in 1783 by the officers of the Continental Army, including George Washington. The organization chose the name Cincinnati deliberately, signaling their commitment to the Roman model of leadership, military men who would not become tyrants. The city of Cincinnati, Ohio, established shortly afterward, bears his name as a tribute to the same ideal to this day. Across modern political history, Cincinnatus has continued to inspire. His story has been referenced in leadership speeches, civic education, and even wartime propaganda. Napoleon Bonaparte in his early days liked to compare himself to Cincinnatus, though his later grasp of power proved the danger of invoking the name without embodying the lesson in action. In contrast, leaders like Cato the Younger, George Washington, and Nelson Mandela all have been linked to the Cincinnatian model, those who stepped down when they could have stayed, those who chose legacy over dominance. Ultimately, Cincinnatus remains a lodestar for any republic that hopes to endure. His legacy is not carved into the monuments of conquest, but written in the values of governance, that true power lies not in how long it is held, but how wisely it is surrendered. His name reminds us that simplicity can be stronger than splendor, that a plow can be mightier than a throne, and that history reserves its greatest honors not for those who rule the longest, but for those who know when to stop. And more than 2,000 years later, on the other side of the world, the Roman ideal of Cincinnatus would find its clearest reflection in a man standing at the crossroads of a new nation. In the wake of revolution, as a fragile republic struggled to define itself, George Washington emerged not only as a victorious general and founding father, but as the embodiment of this ancient virtue: power held lightly, duty answered without personal ambition. If Cincinnatus had laid down his sword to return to the plow, then Washington too would reject the crown to return to Mount Vernon. The parallels were not lost on his contemporaries, nor are they lost on us today. In Washington, Cincinnatus was reborn, reimagined in buckled boots and a powdered wig, standing once more as a testament to the quiet strength of restraint. George Washington's journey began not with certainty of greatness, but with a quiet formation of character on the tobacco fields and rolling hills of colonial Virginia. Born in 1732 into a modest family of the planter class, Washington was no aristocrat, yet he bore himself with a sense of quiet dignity and aspiration that would set him apart. The early loss of his father meant that he never received a formal European education like many of his peers, but Washington compensated through voracious self-study. He devoured books on manners, leadership, and classical virtue. Among his most treasured texts was Cato, Joseph Addison's neoclassical play about the Roman senator who dies rather than subject to tyranny. As a young man, Washington's imposing physical presence, tall, broad-shouldered, and composed, was matched by an ambition that was more focused on reputation than power. He began his public life as a land surveyor, charting the western frontier of Virginia, a profession that gave him both wealth and a first-hand understanding of the raw edges of the British colonies. But his first real test came as a militia officer during the French and Indian War. His early military career was marked by both boldness and blunders. His involvement in the ill-fated skirmish at Fort Necessity showed a certain recklessness, and yet the crisis revealed the seeds of his future greatness. He learned hard lessons of discipline, humility, and the limits of personal glory. What distinguished Washington even then was not perfection, but reflection. He was keenly aware of reputation, what the ancients called fama, and he builds his life upon the model of a virtuous Roman citizen soldier. In his rules of civility and decent behavior, a list of 110 maxims he copied by hand as a teenager, Washington trained himself to live with composure, modesty, and grace in all things. These principles were not ornamental. They became the architecture of his public identity. He knew that the world was watching, and whether on the battlefield or in the chambers of government, he resolved to be a man worthy of the myth, worthy of the republic he would one day help build. Washington's rise in colonial society was neither swift nor effortless. After his military service in the French and Indian War, he returned to Virginia with mixed acclaim. He had shown courage under fire and earned the respect of many, but he also had suffered defeats and blunders that bruised his pride and reputation. Still, he emerged with the conflict with a reputation as a disciplined, honorable man, traits that would serve him well in public life. He married the wealthy widow Martha Custis in 1759, gaining both considerable land and social standing. At Mount Vernon, he became a model of the landed Virginia gentry, managing the plantation, overseeing the household, and serving in the Virginia House of Burgesses. Yet Washington was not content to live as a mere provincial farmer. Beneath his calm exterior lay a deep dissatisfaction with British rule, and a simmering belief that the colonies deserved more than to be treated as subjects on the fringe of an empire. Washington's political instincts matured over this period. He watched as Britain tightened its grip on the colonies, first through taxes like the Stamp Act, and then through increasingly punitive measures meant to silence dissent. Washington did not erupt in a fiery rhetoric like some of his contemporaries. Instead, his resistance was quiet. He began to correspond with colonial leaders, to study Enlightenment thinkers like Locke and Montesquieu, and to shape a worldview rooted in natural rights and republican liberty. By the 1770s, he had come to see British policies not just as unfair, but as morally intolerable. His belief in duty, to one's fellow citizens, to virtue, and the idea of a just society had been forged in the wilderness and refined in the halls of Virginia politics. When the time came to choose a leader for the Continental Army, it was not his eloquence that elevated him, but the sheer gravity of his presence. In 1775, when he arrived at the Second Continental Congress in full military dress, towering above the room in his blue uniform, the message was unmistakable. He was ready to serve. He was not the best general on paper. He had no formal European training and few major victories under his belt. But what Washington represented was far more important. He embodied unity. He was a Southerner who could lead a rebellion sparked in New England. He was respected without being flashy, admired without being feared, and perhaps most critically, he had already begun to cultivate the virtue that would define his role in the revolution. Not ambition, but restraint. As the war loomed ahead, the stakes grew unfathomably high. Washington would prove again and again that the truest mark of leadership was not in how one claimed power, but how one chose to wield it. When Congress appointed him commander-in-chief of the Continental Army in 1775, he inherited a ragtag militia with little discipline, poor equipment, and scant resources. He faced not only the most formidable military power on earth, but also internal disarray, divided colonial loyalties, and the burden of expectation. Yet Washington understood the nature of this war. It was not about battlefield glory, but endurance. His strategy from the beginning was not to win every battle, but to sustain the army, to keep the cause alive, to prove that Americans could govern and defend themselves with dignity. The early years of the war tested every ounce of Washington's resilience. After laying siege to Boston and forcing the British to evacuate, his army suffered crushing defeats in New York. Washington's forces were pushed into retreat and morale plummeted. It seemed the revolution might die in its infancy. Yet in December 1776, he executed the daring crossing of the Delaware River and launched a surprise attack at Trenton. It was a modest military victory, but an immense psychological one. Trenton, followed by the victory at Princeton, revived the revolutionary spirit and showed that Washington's leadership could turn the tide even when the odds were dire. As the war dragged on, Washington faced political intrigues that sought to undermine him, including the Conway Cabal, an attempt by several officers and congressmen to replace him. Yet Washington refused to retaliate or cling to power through fear. His restraint earned him even greater loyalty. When General Benedict Arnold betrayed the cause, and when mutinies broke out over unpaid wages, Washington's ability to balance authority with empathy kept the Revolutionary Army from collapsing. His crowning moment came at the Siege of Yorktown in 1781. With the French assistance, he forced the surrender of General Cornwallis. It was the final major battle of the war, and while Washington knew that peace was not yet secured, he had brought the war to a decisive close. But what is perhaps most remarkable is what Washington did next. With the war won, he did not seize control of the new nation. Instead, he resigned his commission to Congress in 1783, returning to Mount Vernon as a private citizen. King George III reportedly remarked upon hearing this that if Washington truly gave up power, quote, he will be the greatest man in the world. In that moment, Washington had become not just a war hero, but a legend. His rejection of tyranny became the moral foundation of a republic built not on conquest, but on consent. Washington proved that leadership was not about domination. It was about sacrifice, the rarest kind of strength. When the new U.S. Constitution was ratified in 1788, there was no real question of who should lead the fledgling republic. George Washington was unanimously elected as the first president of the United States, taking office in 1789. He was a symbol of unity and embodiment of trust, and the only man that all factions could agree on. From the outset, Washington knew that the eyes of the world were on the United States. Every action he took would set precedent. There had never been an elected head of state in a modern republic with such authority, so he moved with deliberate caution. One of his wisest acts was surrounding himself with brilliant and often conflicting minds. Chief among them were Alexander Hamilton, his Secretary of Treasury, and Thomas Jefferson, his Secretary of State. The two men represented the diverging visions of America: Hamilton's industrial, centralized federalism, and Jefferson's agrarian states' rights idealism. Rather than trying to suppress disagreement, Washington allowed the two to debate, valuing the checks of opposing viewpoints. His first term was devoted to stabilizing the economy, paying off war debts, and ensuring the respect of foreign nations. With Hamilton's controversial financial plans, including the creation of the Bank of the United States, Washington often sided with federal authority, believing national unity depended on strong institutions. Yet he was no autocrat. When Western farmers revolted over an unpopular whiskey tax, Washington led troops personally to suppress the rebellion, not to crush dissent, but to reaffirm the Constitution's legal authority. And then, just as critically, he pardoned the rebels, balancing justice with mercy. The partisan divide between Jeffersonian Republicans and Hamiltonian Federalists grew sharper. Washington loathed political parties, fearing they would divide the nation, and he was right. Still, he kept the peace, steering America through foreign threats like the French Revolution and avoiding entangling alliances through diplomatic restraint. His farewell address in 1796, drafted with Hamilton's help, warned against factionalism and permanent foreign entanglements. It became one of the most quoted documents in U.S. history, not just for what it said, but because of what it signified. Washington was stepping down. This voluntary abandonment of power after 2 terms set the most sacred precedent in American politics, that no president should serve for life. Washington could have easily remained in office until death. He was adored, and no successor could match his stature. But he believed in the primacy of the republic over any one man. In doing so, he modeled the very restraint that had once made Cincinnatus so revered. He returned to Mount Vernon, this time for good. Washington died just 3 years later, in 1799, after falling ill from a throat infection. His death sent a wave of mourning through the young nation. Even his former political enemies paused to honor him. Napoleon Bonaparte, the first consul of France, ordered 10 days of mourning in French territories. Washington had become more than a man. He was an ideal. A general who gave up his sword. A president who gave up his office. A mortal who behaved like a myth. And in doing so, he became eternal. His legacy lives on in every peaceful transfer of power, every oath taken under the Constitution, and every moment a leader chooses the republic over themselves. What sets George Washington apart from nearly every other figure in human history is not just the power he held, but what he was willing to give up. In an age where European monarchs ruled by divine right, when emperors and kings clung to their thrones with bloodied hands, Washington walked away, twice. That act of restraint, of stepping down from power not once but twice after the Revolution and his presidency, was more revolutionary than the war itself. It broke the mold of leadership that the world knew. In my opinion, that makes him one of the greatest men to ever live. He came from modest colonial beginnings, and while he carried himself with a commanding presence, he never allowed wealth or prestige to corrupt his sense of purpose. In a time where leadership was synonymous with aristocracy, opulence, and entitlement, Washington embodied humility, duty, and simplicity. He rejected kingship when it was offered. He warned against political factionalism even as it swirled around him. He chose the plow over the palace. That clarity of judgment and quiet strength set a political and philosophical precedent unlike anything that had ever been seen before. And the world noticed this. Throughout the 19th century, monarchies across Europe began to falter. Not just because of economic or military reasons, but because of a new vision of leadership had taken root. One where power was not inherited but earned. One where rulers served the people, not the other way around. Washington's example echoed across revolutions, from France to Latin America. His legacy wasn't just American, it was universal. A reminder that the greatest leaders are not those who accumulate power, but those who can let it go. When we study the lives of Cincinnatus and George Washington, we are not just reading the stories of two great men in their own right. We are discovering a blueprint for virtuous leadership that applies far beyond the battlefield or the halls of power. Whether you're leading a company, managing a team, raising a family, or simply navigating your own personal ambitions, there are powerful lessons in knowing when to act, when to serve, and when to take a step back. Cincinnatus shows us the value of purpose over pride. He was a man who answered the call when his republic needed him but refused to let the power define him. When the crisis was over, he relinquished his authority and returned to the plow. That act teaches us that leadership is not just about personal elevation. It's about service and duty. When your task is complete, walking away can be the highest form of integrity. For anyone in a leadership role, this reminds us, your identity should not be tied to your title. The strength lies in knowing who you are without it. Washington in turn modeled restraint and precedent. He had every opportunity to rule indefinitely. His popularity was unmatched. His military prowess elevated him to near legendary status. Yet he stepped away, twice. First from command from the Revolution, and then again after 2 terms as president. His choice carved out the American ideal that power must be limited and rotational, not permanent. This is a lesson in legacy over control. In business, politics, or relationships, holding on too long can erode what you built. Washington reminds us that sometimes the best way to lead is to prepare others to lead after you. Both men demonstrated humility and simplicity at its finest. Neither adorned themselves with luxury or demanded royal treatment. Cincinnatus returned to manual labor. Washington returned to Mount Vernon. These choices reflected a mindset rooted not in ego but in grounded purpose. For modern life, that teaches us to resist the seduction of constant scaling, dominating, and growing just for the sake of it. There is virtue in stillness. There is greatness in choosing a life of substance over spectacle. And perhaps most importantly, both men taught that true authority is earned through service, not seized through ambition. In today's world of branding, hustling, and self-promotion, their stories whisper a countercultural truth. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is walk away, not out of defeat, but because you fulfilled your duty, and because by stepping back, you allow something bigger than yourself to grow in your place. This is not just ancient wisdom. It's timeless leadership. Modern politics, whether democratic or autocratic, suffers not from a lack of intelligence or ambition, but from a near-total absence of restraint. The instinct to hold power, to consolidate it, to even cling to it when the public or posterity demands otherwise, has become the default position. We live in a time with the notion of stepping down gracefully is seen not as a strength but as failure. And yet, when we look back across the grand sweep of history, it is precisely those who relinquished power who rise to the top of our admiration. This restraint is not a passive trait. It's forged in fire. Cincinnatus has seen the chaos of early Rome, its fractures and fragilities. He could have ruled indefinitely, but he chose instead to reinforce the Republic. Washington had led an army through brutal winters and impossible odds, held together by a fragile coalition of states, and stood at the helm of a brand new nation. He had every right to extend his presidency, but he didn't, because he knew that example was more powerful than the office itself. And think about throughout all of history with all its kings and emperors how rare that is. Napoleon couldn't walk away. He returned from exile to reclaim his throne, only to lose everything at Waterloo. Hitler refused to cede control as Berlin crumbled, dragging his nation into the abyss. Caesar, crowned and adored, could not resist the pull of eternal rule, and paid for it in the Senate with 23 knives. The world is full of men who grasped too tightly, whose legacies were shattered not by enemies but by their own unwillingness to let go. There's a lesson here not just for presidents or dictators, but for every single one of us. In our businesses, our relationships, and even our personal ambitions, there's virtue knowing when to let go and walk away. Sometimes you need to step back and let others rise. When to trust that the work is finished, the foundation laid, and the legacy is secure. Walking away is not failure. It is the final, most powerful act of service. So as I close this episode, I want to return to the myths that we began with. Those stories told of gods and mortals, of tragic heroes and fallen kings, remind us that history is not just a record of what happened. It's a morality tale, a mirror. And the gods of history, call them memory, judgment, or truth, do not smile upon those who hoard power. They reserve their blessings for those who knew when enough was enough. Cincinnatus and Washington passed the test. They chose the harder path, and in doing so, they carved their names not into crowns, but into something far more lasting, the conscience of civilization. And that, perhaps, is the greatest power of all. Thanks for listening to Talks History with Donnie Dodson. If you found this episode thought-provoking, make sure to subscribe and share it with someone who's just as fascinated with the past as you are. And if you want to explore more of my work, including my historical recipes and video essays, visit eatshistory.com and all of my socials that go by the same name. Until next time, Donnie Dodson.